Following video, we're going to be talking about the act of criticism and how important it is to stay critical of something in general. We're going to divulge into the argument of large language models creating noise on the internet and why I personally think that this is a very logically inconsistent argument with the current state of the internet. And from there, we're going to take a look at a ridiculous example to prove that large language models are actually helpful in helping us be more critical thinkers at the end of the day. So if you want to see the text version of this, check out the description below for members. And if you like this, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a thumbs down. Please make sure to subscribe and have a good day. Okay. Today, we are going to be talking about criticism, writing and criticism. And I want to talk about this particularly. I don't like to really be divisive with my work, not because I don't think that there's not value in being divisive, but I think a lot of the time when you're arguing on the internet, it's like arguing into a void where no one will ever think that they're wrong anyway. So it's kind of a waste of time. But I have been hearing some arguments that I recently seen a lot of that I think are pretty logically inconsistent. And I kind of want to draw attention to those, specifically about the incoming amount of noise that's going to happen through large language models, particularly how much new content is going to be put onto the internet. You might have seen Drake AI, or you might have seen all these deep fakes going around, or all these images, and there's a fear kind of going through the internet mainstream, or at least the internet that I'm privy to, that people are worried that this is going to decrease the overall quality of the internet. And I actually want to argue that that's ridiculous, because the internet's already kind of trash, and I can show it to you. Or good, depending on your own experience with it. But I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. And then we're going to talk about what it means to write, what it means to say something, and then what it means to criticize, most importantly. So this is from the book Time of the Magicians, which is a great book about philosophers in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Wittgenstein, Benjamin, Cassier, and Heidegger. Specifically, this is, I think, the 1930s that this book is mostly centralized on. And this quote, "And why not those who can write about anything," is basically this kind of conceived notion of saying, well, once you have the ability to write, you can write about anything you want, right? Like, what's stopping a person from writing? But then the interesting conversation comes up is, well, what about the reader? What about the people who are going to be consuming this writing? How are they going to deal with it? Like, is it going to activate the critical part of their brain that allows them to question an argument, or is it going to be something that they just accept at face value? For Benjamin, the crucial impulse of these early romantic thinkers lay in the fact that the activity of criticism, if understood correctly, leaves neither the criticizing subject, the art critic, nor the criticized object, the work of art, unaffected. Both are transformed in the process, ideally towards truth. The thesis of the constant enrichment through the work of art, in Benjamin's view, on two fundamental concepts of German Romanticism. Everything that exists is in a dynamic relationship, not only with other things, but also with itself, which is called the thesis of self-referentiality of all things. The subject, by criticizing an object, activates and mobilizes this dynamic relationship between the two by mobilizing their references both to each other and to other things, the thesis of the activation of all references of criticism. So you, right now, as a viewer, are serving as the criticizing subject of this video, which is the work of art, right? This work of art is changed by what you see in a way that doesn't necessarily make itself immediately clear. One might say, well, the video itself doesn't change. Once you upload it, it's going to be static forever, right? But as with any piece of art or any piece of media, there is multiple ways to look at something that basically means that this video means different things to different people, the same way that a book means something different to different people because they have a different experience. Their different experience, their different perspective on the world helps shape the work of art in real time and allows it to be viewed from an angle that actually also changes the work of art going forward through the eyes of other people, right? Because it's like, oh, I saw this and this, so the next time that I watch Into the Spider-Verse or something, for example, I'll see something different in it too. Why is this relevant? So we've kind of been entering, again, like a large discourse conversation about the value of what these large language models are going to provide, and particularly kind of people being worried about the spread of maligned propaganda, governments being overthrown, and economies being taken over. And a lot of that is prophecy, and prophecy in and of itself is a claim to know something that isn't privy to reality, but it's also bad because it's unable to be criticized, right? When you make that kind of claim, then obviously the immune system response of the society that cares about itself should be to destroy the thing as opposed to understand the thing. And that is not a healthy way of doing things. And I actually have a good example of that here, where I got into a small YouTube argument with a YouTuber whose name is Upper Echelon. I can link his channel in the description if I remember to do that. These videos are very low res, as you can obviously tell, so I don't really spend much time on the editing process. So what I got into it about him with was this kind of, again, this tone, this narrative that he was generating, which he was saying that like Twitter is about to be filled with a bunch of noise and yada yada this, and no one's going to be able to believe anything because it's all going to be fake and yada yada yada. So I wanted to point out some things that I thought that he really lacked nuance on, and this is kind of me criticizing, and then this goes to show you an example of what I think is good criticism and what I think is bad criticism. And this is my own perspective of just being an arguer, right? So I said, I usually like your stuff. So basically I started out by saying like, hey, this isn't meant to be an attack, but I want to point out that I think that you lacked nuance here, right? I think that there was some stuff that you missed, that you kind of created this work of art, this video, without really fairly addressing these counter arguments. So I said the tone of this video was that society is equal to Twitter's age, therefore bots on Twitter somehow equal the destruction of society, which is a wild take. This isn't really fully my take. A lot of this take comes from kind of spending a lot of time in the Cal Newport sphere, where he's done a really good job of reminding his audience that the internet isn't the entire world and that there's a lot of deep work that has been done by people throughout the millennia, writing books and working in the woods and like living these kind of slow lives where they kind of have contemplated really deep things. You know, he mentioned in his last episode that Newton wrote the Principia Mathematica over 25 years, which is something that I didn't know, but that makes sense, right? Given the depth and breadth of that work. But it seems like with the kind of Zoomer doomer mentality that Twitter is the town square, and if we lose Twitter to robots, then society is over, which is just, when you look at it, insane, because it's a website that serves text, right? Like even if there was a huge network on it, that doesn't mean that it's the backbone of our society, right? Cherry picking a few articles and bad apples to build a narrative, right? So this is kind of, again, this idea of what I was talking about up here, where you can kind of say anything about anything and sound rational and fair. My handwriting is terrible, especially when I'm on a mouse, while simultaneously discouraging discussion by catastrophizing. I think catastrophizing is really important, because catastrophizing is basically saying there is no other thing that could happen except the thing that I think is going to happen. And it's, I think, a natural thing to do. It's one of those things that is very easy to fall into in terms of an argument because it sounds good and it's emotional. But once you take away the emotion from it, you realize that it's like, oh yeah, I am just kind of seeing the worst case scenario, and there's no way that I could accurately predict the future to that level of acuity. So conflating a way of life to stable is an anti-pattern. So again, the big narrative of this video was that our way of life is under siege by these large language models. But then I said, well, that same whole logic holds for people in 12 AD who would have never phased out crucifixes. You know, this is kind of one of those things that I got from David Deutsch, where he talks about parochial societies like Sparta that would punish people for trying to change the society as opposed to letting people be their creative selves. Weirdly enough, I do think that we live in a country where it's both highly democratic and individualized, in the sense that people are able to do what they want. And by we, I mean I'm an American citizen, so that won't hold true for the non-American viewers of this video. America is very entrepreneurial, but weirdly has this kind of undercurrent where a lot of Americans are very pro-business to a point that they forget that they are cheering for business and they're not cheering for a way of life. And I think that that is kind of an anti-pattern, because it basically captures us in this idea that our businesses are the American way of life, as opposed to the American way of life allows for businesses to exist. So you can consider what that means. The implications of any technological advancement can only be considered in hindsight. Should we take away people's literacy so that they can't read propaganda, or their stoves so they can't burn themselves? How about their computers so there's no malware? Basically what I was trying to get across here is that it's really easy to sit on a horse and be like, oh, well, I told you so type arguments. And I think some people like these YouTubers like Upper Echelon here are making this point where they are basically trying to become the I told you so's if things do go wrong. And that to me just feels like a really sad way to live. I don't know. I don't really know what to say about that. I think that that's not even really critical. That's just more kind of like, I don't want the world to be different than the way that I know it to be, which is a very kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of pitiful. Not in pitiful in the sense that it's like, oh, I pity you. It's like, it's pitiful in the sense that it's like kind of sad. You know what I mean? It's like the world can be a lot more vast than you give it credit for, which is very evidenced by how much complexity we've been able to abstract away into our current way of life. Right now, I'm talking into a metal object that is using cords to turn something into electricity, and then that data is being uploaded through your screen as photons and then coming back out to you as audio data. In a different point in time, time and space. And that's like pretty awesome, right? So it's just, it seems to me that like if you kind of want to prevent people from learning, for example, like the church tried to prevent people, the Catholic Church in the 1600s tried to prevent people from phasing into literacy, and then under the claim that, well, once people learn how to read, they're going to learn how to read propaganda, to me is just ridiculous. So I think that basically my core point here is that he was just trying to make great YouTube content. He wanted to have a simple narrative with kind of big letters and kind of spell the doomsday scenario with the worst case, but that's no better than the 24-hour news cycle. And I don't really watch the news for this reason, where they just need to keep the emotional valence high, and they need to kind of always be saying something that's just really intense and really kind of like, oh, pay attention to me. Like right now the world is breaking, which I think is also kind of, again, an anti-pattern, because they can write about whatever they want, right? Which is at the top of this point, is that you can write about whatever you want, but that doesn't mean that A, you shouldn't open yourself up to changing your opinions based on criticism, but B, you should kind of try and hopefully seek objectivity about something. So I suggested to him a more tactful approach. I said, well, AI is a technology. In the immediate future, I presume that something will happen. This could be a good thing. This could be a bad thing. This could just be whatever, right? But most importantly, this is my opinion. I've built XYZ, and from that, I learned this, which allows you to be informed. And as an informed watcher, which is, for example, you watching this video right now, you might want to try M on your own machine or consider idea N. And what I meant by this is kind of like saying, like, don't, again, take everything that you see on the internet at face value. And obviously people don't. And I think that this kind of argument that's happening is that like people, I'm of two minds about this. Your ideas should be logically consistent to the point that you can attack them yourself and understand where people are going to come at your idea from. And B, you shouldn't necessarily open yourself up to any vector of attack either, right? Like, he didn't need to respond to this comment. I knew that he spent more time on the video than I spent on the comment, but I was hoping to help change the narrative of the video by pointing out things that I think could have been done better in a way that was, again, like not trying to just be like, I'm trying to attack you. And here's a good example of an attack. To not be afraid of AI is holistically fucking stupid. So that to me is just an ad hominem attack, right? The response to basically me saying like, hey, like here's some things that I think that you might be doing, a catastrophizing thing. Again, you don't have to take any of this to heart. As a matter of fact, I think people should stand up for their arguments, right? Because who's going to represent their argument better than themselves? But I was basically saying like, hey, like there are parts of your argument that could actually become stronger in future videos where you might have the same take about this idea of how LLMs are going to ruin Twitter and that's going to ruin society. If you consider these things, right? If you consider that you're doing these anti-patterns, and if you're considering the lack of nuance and the catastrophizing that you're doing in this video, then you might notice that there's actually a better argument to be had. Now, really quickly, I just want to talk about what I meant about this notion that the more LLM data on the internet means that the internet's going to be filled with noise and no one's going to know what to trust anymore. So let's say that this is your conception of the internet, right? So like your conception of the internet is maybe your favorite YouTube channels, your favorite Twitter that you follow, your mediums that you read, Hacker News, or whatever you find yourself on. This is how much internet is uploaded every day to the internet, right? Not even, this doesn't even do it credit, right? This circle is not even visible compared to this one, right? It's like the sun and the earth, right? The difference in these two sizes is astronomical. And the point that I'm making here is that the internet is already filled with noise. For as far as you can kind of consider, most of the internet to you is noise. It's not something that's ever going to enter your framework of understanding or your framework of being. Most people on the internet will never see this video. This video will never exist to them. And it's the same with this upper echelon video, right? It's really easy to assume that our perspective of the world is the entire world. Last I read, I think in this one research paper, they were like 1.7 megabytes per person per second is uploaded to the internet, which is just an insane amount of data, right? Like even this canvas that you're seeing this on, you know, this image might be a few hundred kilobytes and this text here is a few kilobytes, right? This would add up to roughly about 1.5 megabytes. So I think that this argument is really just kind of silly because it doesn't really kind of like what ends up happening. What's the most important part from this becoming this? And this is the thing that I'm going to talk about in a second here is criticality, right? So right now we have a lot of algorithms, for example, that do us the work of saying like, I think that this is something that you would like. This is something that people in your cohort like. This is something that is similar to your recommended videos. You should probably check this thing out. But that's not always like good, right? Like it's not always a good system that does that. So I think that can we use large language models to help us become more critical thinkers is a really interesting question. And to prove that point, I'm actually going to do something with ChatGPT real quick. So let's go with the default GPT model here. here, and let's say that we want to generate arguments for and against why SpongeBob should be, like, let's just use a ridiculous argument. Come up with 2 arguments for and against why SpongeBob SquarePants should run for Congress. So here's what I mean, right? Like, when you have an idea, even a ridiculous one, and large language model doesn't really see it as ridiculous for the first part, right? It'll take it as seriously as it takes anything else. These things aren't necessarily meant to, again, point out your facts. Like, what are the facts about SpongeBob running for Congress? They serve as items that you can tear away at and criticize that are very easily made, right? So for example, it said, hey, well, SpongeBob is one of the most recognizable cartoon characters in the world. His popularity might help him get support for a political campaign, but he's also a cartoon character, so he has no political experience. But he's optimistic, fun-loving, and humorous attempts at problem solving could bring much needed levity to the tense and divisive atmosphere of Congress. However, it's important for elected officials to be taken seriously by their colleagues and constituents, and SpongeBob's candidacy might not be seen as a legitimate attempt to engage in politics. So this is obviously a ridiculous example, but the point that I'm making here is that we actually get to see 2 counterpoints being made. We had it right about something completely random, right? Like, a lot of the point of this criticism thing was that, like, GPT is now one of the devices that can write anything, but then we can move as the criticizer towards truth from the work of art that we're trying to, that we're looking at, right? So we can say, like, oh, hey, like, the criticism that we have for SpongeBob, let's say that I don't agree that SpongeBob would bring levity to his office. He is a very hardworking fry cook and would work hard for his district. I agree with you that SpongeBob is a hardworking character and would undoubtedly work hard for if he was elected to Congress. He would not take the job seriously, but rather that some people might perceive it as a gimmick, which would undermine his ability. Okay, so how would the opposition reframe this? How would the opposition reframe my argument? So if the opposition wanted to reframe your argument about how SpongeBob would work hard, they would say, well, he's a hardworking fry cook, but being a fast food industry hard worker doesn't necessarily translate to being a legislator. The skills needed for success in a restaurant are vastly different from those needed to navigate the complex socio-political issues of a legislative process. SpongeBob may be a well-intentioned candidate, but without the necessary experience and knowledge, he would struggle to effectively represent his district's interest in Congress. So again, this gets to play both sides, and then we get to choose at the end of the day. Maybe SpongeBob is a good character for Congress, maybe he's not. The point that I'm trying to point out here is that LLMs won't reduce our ability for criticality. Our ability for criticality is already self-prescribed by the people who choose to be critical of something in the first place and come up with their own ideas. So that's the video. Thank you for watching. We just talked about criticism for the past 20 minutes and excited to kind of get back into the regular content later. So thank you for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Make sure to subscribe and have a good one.